The vast tidewater basin sprawling across the southern tip of Texas, known collectively as Bahia Grande, encompasses approximately 10,000 acres of wetlands and is the largest coastal restoration project in Texas and one of the largest in the United States. Situated between the cities of Brownsville and Port Isabel along the lower Gulf Coast, just north of the Rio Grande, Bahia Grande is home to thriving populations of marine life and myriad species of birds. Construction of a permanent channel to completely fill and circulate water through the entire estuary will be completed by early 2022. However, marine life is already flourishing, as evidenced by this immense school of redfish sequestered in a remote corner of the sanctuary. In addition to restoring the 6,500-acre Bahia Grande Basin, interior channels were cut that reconnected two adjacent smaller basins, Laguna Larga and Little Laguna Madre. Bahia Grande currently thrives as a functioning estuary and is once again home to nesting brown pelicans and wintering white pelicans. However, enlargement of the existing channel will greatly enhance productivity. For decades, the historic wetland was a dust bowl. Construction of the ship channel connecting the Gulf of Mexico to the port of Brownsville in the early 1930s cut off tidal flow to Bahia Grande, desiccating a productive estuary and creating an immense dust bowl, where once thousands of terns and colonial waterbirds nested and fish thrived. After more than 25 years of cooperative effort with some 65 partners, known as the Bahia Grande Restoration Partnership, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service purchased the Bahia Grande property in 2000, and in 2005 dug a pilot channel called Gaiman Channel, partially filling the historic wetland. This abated a persistent dust problem, and Bahia Grande has begun to thrive, but the temporary channel needs to be widened to provide increased water flow, which will keep the estuary from becoming hypersaline or saltier than the sea. Total land in the Bahia Grande tract is 22,000 acres, with approximately half destined for wetland restoration, and the other providing valuable coastal prairie habitat for native wildlife such as the endangered Aplomado falcon. This remarkable restoration of a vital tidewater basin and protection of vanishing coastal prairie is emblematic of how, through cooperative efforts between state, federal, and private entities, positive change can be achieved. In a time when conservation achievements are difficult to realize, the historic restoration of Bahia Grande is a stellar symbol of success. The Bahia Grande unit is part of Laguna Atascosa National Wildlife Refuge, which comprises 113,000 acres and represents the largest parcel of native wildlands open to the public in deep South Texas. Bahia Grande has already been open to seasonal hunting, and plans are underway to provide the public with a variety of recreational opportunities, such as hiking, biking, and wildlife photography. This historic wetland and coastal prairie restoration represents one of the greatest wildlife success stories in the nation, and Bahia Grande will be an integral part of the refuge system for wildlife protection and public recreation for generations to come. The inspiring story of how this remarkable restoration unfolded over decades is a tribute to the cooperative efforts of many people, such as rancher and landowner Frank Uturia, County Commissioner David Garza, various United States Fish and Wildlife Service personnel, including the late refuge manager Steve Thompson, who envisioned early on the vital importance of restoring Bahia Grande. The United States Fish and Wildlife Service recognized more than 80 years ago that Bahia Grande was important wildlife habitat, but it has taken nearly a century to acquire and restore the historic wetland and surrounding coastal prairie, where towering yuccas and blooming prickly pear cactus encircle a thriving estuarine ecosystem. John Wallace, former manager of Laguna Atascosa, recalls those early surveys identifying Bahia Grande as critical habitat for native wildlife and migratory waterfowl.
The Bahia Grande area was identified by the Fish and Wildlife Service back in 1939 as a national wildlife refuge to acquire it and to restore the San Martin Lake and Bahia Grande wetlands in 1939. The Fish and Wildlife Service were doing reconnaissance surveys across the United States, and that was one of the areas they looked at. But it was not until 1998 and 1999 before the service finally was able to acquire the Bahia Grande area. And that was the impetus for the local community that now we can do something to restore that area.
More than 60 government entities, private companies, and individuals have cooperated to restore Bahia Grande, and one of the most important people who helped secure acquisition and eventual restoration was South Texas rancher Frank Uturia. Uturia passed away in 2018, but his conservation legacy lives on.
They built a ship channel that cut the Bahia Grande off from the sea, and you didn't get any tidal water in it at all. And I remember when I was a kid, I'm talking about when I was 7, 8 years old, my father and mother and friends, we used to drive over to the Bahia Grande. Now the only way to get there then, you took the Boca Chica Highway and then you cut across land and went across where the channel is now to the Bahia. And in those days, you really didn't need any fishing tackle. The crabs were so plentiful, you just walked along the shore and scooped them up with a net. Redfish be in shallow water, and every now and then you could get one with your net. And it was that full of fish. But it was a magnificent estuary. And then in the wintertime, the area would get filled with ducks and wild geese. And all that now has disappeared. I hope one day it'll come back.
Uturia was instrumental in convincing his fellow landowners to sell their property to Fish and Wildlife, as he longed to see Bahia Grande recover its former magnificence. Boyd Blihovde, who recently served as manager of Laguna Atascosa, recognizes we all owe a debt of gratitude to Frank Uturia.
We're just so lucky that Frank Uturia was alive and still around to make it happen, because I don't know if the property would have been protected if it wasn't for Frank.
Sunrise over Bahia Grande reveals skeletal stretch of ancient trestle, tracing a long line towards the eastern horizon. Long before construction of the Brownsville Ship Channel in the mid-1930s and Highway 48 in 1953, linking Brownsville to Port Isabel, cut off tidal flow to Bahia Grande, a narrow-gauge railroad was constructed through Bahia Grande in 1872, bisecting the estuary into a northern and southern basin. Weathered hand-hewn cypress logs still stand as silent sentinels to the narrow-gauge railroad bridge built almost 150 years ago. The sturdy lumber and pilings were delivered from Mobile, Alabama. In choosing to build the shortest line possible between Brownsville and Port Isabel, the Rio Grande Railroad Company crossed Bahia Grande with a 15,500-foot trestle. This reduced but did not eliminate internal circulation, and marine life and waterfowl continued to thrive. Hunters were often allowed to disembark from the train to shoot the multitudes of ducks and geese. Redhead ducks in particular were in abundance, as more than 80% of the million-plus redheads that historically overwinter in North America reside along the Laguna Madre.
There were historical accounts of up to 15,000 redheads at a time using that Bahia Grande Basin.
However, the hurricane of 1874 destroyed extensive sections of the trestle, and subsequent storms wiped out additional portions. Cameron County Marine Extension Agent Tony Reisinger has been involved with the restoration of Bahia Grande for decades, and the ancient trestle whets his thirst for more historical knowledge of the area.
We know the history. We know that there is this beautiful trestle that was constructed of cypress, hand-hewn cypress pilings across the Bahia Grande to connect Port Isabel to Brownsville. So that's some of the history of it, but finding out more about the prehistory would be phenomenal.
Archaeological studies were conducted prior to the re-inundation of Bahia Grande, and campsites were unearthed revealing an extensive use of the area by Native Americans.
It was a fantastic estuary in the past, historically. There's evidence that, there were Native American fish camps 5,000 years ago where they were catching black drum and consuming black drum right there on the Bahia Grande. So it was, I'm sure, for the Native Americans a fishing ground and a hunting ground, for the waterfowl that were there and for the fish that were there.
Where a century and a half ago an aged narrow-gauge trestle spanned the basin, venerable cypress pilings now serve as roosting sites for abundant water birds as Bahia Grande begins to come full circle. Tony Reisinger, Cameron County Marine Extension Agent and marine biologist with Texas Sea Grant, credits his agency as being in the forefront of the historic restoration.
Texas Sea Grant was the catalyst for this success story. We've been involved in it the whole time, and it's one of the largest wetland restorations in the United States that I'm aware of.
Reisinger, who has been working in South Texas for more than 35 years, remembers talking with one of the area's old-timers who reminisced about how productive Bahia Grande once was.
And he told us about the Laguna Madre scows that were fishing in the Laguna Madre area for redfish. And they would see a school of redfish, and this was a shallow draft sailing vessel. And they would drop a seine all the way and surround the school. And they said they would catch thousands of pounds of redfish. So it was in Bahia Grande and Laguna Madre, all the areas that were opened up before they built the ship channel and Highway 48.
Reisinger was just starting out with Sea Grant in 1983 when what is now known as Gaiman Channel was first excavated in an attempt to link Bahia Grande with the ship channel, and thus once again allow tidal flow to fill the estuary.
And there was a shrimp fleet owner, Joe Gaiman, called me and said that he had this area picked out that he would like to reflood. And he took me for a long ride in a four-wheel drive pickup around an area called Bahia Grande. And it was a dry lake bed, dusty, but he wanted to make it a shrimp nursery area and fish nursery area. He hired a crane operator named Walter Plitt and paid him, I think, $3,000. And Plitt dug a canal in that soupy mud from the channel to Bahia Grande. And on April 9th, 1983, he opened it up.
And nearly half a century after construction of the ship channel blocking flow to Bahia Grande, Joe Gaiman's vision was realized.
Well, it started just as a dream and wound up being the largest wetland restoration project.
And against all the engineering studies that had been done, water flowed into Bahia Grande, and Joe said it was a miracle because water was flowing uphill.
Well, we just laugh about Ursula Ant saying, look at the miracle that water's flowing uphill into Bahia Grande, because he said it was all above sea level. There's no way we'd ever flood it.
And it almost filled up. It had a lot of water went in there, but 13 days later they had to close that. They had to fill it back in because adjacent landowners were worried about losing their rights to their land because it would, I guess, revert to the state.
The long campaign to restore Bahia Grande received a boost in the 1990s when state law was changed so that mineral wealth beneath properties submerged by man-made means remained with property owners rather than reverting to the state. It was then that rancher Frank Uturia spurred effort among landholding families such as the Garcias and Espersons to sell their Bahia properties to the United States Fish and Wildlife Service in 2000. Following purchase of Bahia Grande's some 22,000 acres, with half slated for wetland restoration, the old 1983 Gaiman Channel was redug and opened in 2005. While the reopening of Gaiman Channel, which is referred to as a pilot channel, was successful in filling much of Bahia Grande, the need for a deeper and wider permanent channel was recognized early on as essential in creating sufficient circulation to prevent the basin from becoming hypersaline. The new half-mile permanent channel is being increased in width from 34 feet to as much as 250 feet and deepened from 3 feet to 9, which will increase tidal flow by a factor of 13 times. Work on the $5 million permanent channel is underway and scheduled for completion in early 2022. The project is being implemented by the Texas General Land Office with funding derived from the Deepwater Horizon litigation. The largest marine oil spill in history that took place in 2010 off Louisiana devastated coastal ecosystems of Louisiana and Texas, and the resultant mitigation settlement pumped $238 million into Texas coffers for environmental projects. For the past couple of decades, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service has worked with local colleges and universities to monitor recovery of the estuary, including regular fish and shrimp surveys. Dr. David Hicks, director and professor of the School of Earth, Environmental, and Marine Sciences with the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, has been studying the restoration since the early 1990s.
We actually started, prior to the reflooding. I don't know if you remember, but there was that Hurricane Emily that kind of skirted by us. And it actually pushed a lot of water into Bahia Grande and all the rain. And, for a couple of years, it was flooded and fish populations got established in there. But eventually, because there was no connection, it went dry, it got salty, and there was a big fish kill. But it kind of showed you the potential of what this thing could be if it was actually, connected to tidal waters.
The key to maximizing productivity and restoring Bahia Grande fully to the once productive estuary it was historically requires increasing circulation.
If you look at just the southern portion there near the entrance of just the pilot channel, salinities are pretty close to what they are, a little higher than full strength ocean salinity. And most of our estuarine organisms are well adapted to tolerate that what we say is this 45 to 60 parts per thousand range. And the open ocean, if you go out to test the Gulf of Mexico, it's always at 35 parts per thousand, right? So it's a little bit higher than the Gulf of Mexico, but not too high in that front half that you can't have a thriving estuary like we see in Laguna Madre or South Bay or some of the neighboring estuaries. But once you get beyond the railroad trestle, then the salinities really spike up, and the average salinity back there is close to 80 parts per thousand in the summer. So you can see that that's more than twice full ocean seawater. And there are places where it gets to 160, 180. So now you're looking at almost 3 times as salty as the ocean. And there are very few organisms that can survive in that.
Joining Dr. Hicks in ongoing monitoring of the evolving Bahia Grande ecosystem is Dr. Chris Gabler and his University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley students. For the past several years, Dr. Gabler has been conducting climate change research, and he relishes the chance to have such a marvelous outdoor laboratory for his students to utilize.
The ecological resources in Laguna Viscosa at the Bahia Grande, it is a excellent, world-class ecological laboratory, outdoor classroom, and we use it as much as we possibly can.
Students that have participated in various studies at Bahia Grande are appreciative of the opportunity to work in what for many is a cherished realm of their natural and cultural heritage, like Abney Trevino from Brownsville.
It's really rewarding, working on all these projects, because you're doing something good, for the community and for the ecosystem.
Sam Ortiz, who as a student worked on Bahia Grande research, is now a science teacher himself.
But to know that was happening where I was growing up, and then to eventually get to the point where I can participate in that scientific research was great for me.
We've had tons of undergraduate and graduate students who have done their thesis project and research out there. And like you said, it's kind of like having our own experimental lakes right in our backyard. Through the course, we've actually been able to document how this has changed, like you say, from a totally barren dust bowl to a fully functioning estuarine system. It's quite amazing. That you just don't see that happening everywhere in the U.S. or the world. It's very special.
Of the scores of government entities, private companies, universities, and individuals who have contributed over decades to restore Bahia Grande, no one has been more devoted to this project than Cameron County Commissioner David Garza.
When I became a commissioner in 2001, is when, I started receiving complaints, and anyone that drove to the island knew the issue. Anybody that even played golf in Laguna Vista knew the issue. There was blowing dust everywhere. It was on Highway 100, on Highway 48. There would be dunes of dust that had blown onto the roadways. What brought to light to me all of the community concern was when I was asked to visit the new then high school in Port Isabel. Everything on the south side of the buildings and the football fields were dunes of sand. And I would be called out there and asked to see if the county could send a motor grader to remove the sand from the football field so they could play football games. And then I'd get invited into the building, and everywhere you touch inside the building, there was dust everywhere.
While Garza has been steadfast in his dedication to restoring Bahia Grande, he credits the many partnerships that brought the project to fruition.
I think we had at the heyday of this project 67 or 68 different entities, all supporting the restoration.
One of the longtime supporters has been the Port of Brownsville, on whose property the Game and Channel is located. Port Director Eddie Compriano has been a mainstay of the restoration team for many years.
The Port has been very, very supportive and is part of the team that is seeing this project through. So, throughout, I think, the history of where we are today, the Port has obviously played a role, and we're excited to be able to do so.
The current manager at Laguna Atascosa National Wildlife Refuge, Brandon Jones, is grateful for the decades of cooperation from dozens of partners that have brought the restoration to fulfillment.
Projects of this scale, they're hardly achieved with one single entity. They need multiple partners in them. And so when everybody can find common ground and a common goal to work towards, this is the result we get.
We had a huge conglomeration of partners. The private landowners were extremely important, and the public entities. And it all came to fruition, and we've got a productive estuary now.
Carter Smith, Texas Parks and Wildlife Director, applauds the collaborative success of the largest coastal wetland restoration in the state.
Texas Parks and Wildlife is incredibly proud to be a small partner among dozens of entities that have helped to bring that to fruition. And it's just reflective of the old adage in conservation that we're going to get more done together with all of us pulling the same sled. And Bahia Grande is very emblematic of that. Well, that whole Laguna Madre ecosystem is one of the richest and most iconic, not only in our state, really in our country, if not the whole Western Hemisphere. But for decades, the big missing piece was this giant 10,000-acre tidally influenced wetland that had turned into this massive dust bowl because the tidal exchange had been completely cut off. And so the restoration of that was dreamt about literally for generations by fish and wildlife biologists. And so now with the restoration of that, people of South Texas and really all over the country, if not the world, are going to be able to enjoy that for generations to come. And so there's not a project like it in terms of the scale and scope of restoration in Texas.
Bahia Grande, the largest coastal wetland restoration in the state and one of the largest coastal wetland restoration projects in the United States, shines as a stellar example of what can be accomplished with a unified effort. According to newspaper articles and other archives, calls to reflood Bahia Grande began shortly after the celebration of completing the dredging of the Brownsville Ship Channel in 1936 that sealed off tidal flow to the basin. And with the construction of Highway 48 in 1953, Bahia Grande's dusty fate was sealed in concrete. However, both these projects proceeded long before the advent of environmental impact studies. It has taken nearly a century for those early restoration pleas to be heeded.
2 man-made intentional barriers hopefully will be overcome to recreate what we had, in the early 1900s, even though now it's the early 2000s. 100 years later, we're looking at fixing what we screwed up.
It's the best success story that I've ever experienced.
The extraordinary spirit of cooperation spanning decades throughout the restoration saga of Bahia Grande is emblematic of the remarkable achievements of past Laguna Atascosa Refuge Manager Steve Thompson. Thompson, who passed away in 2018, was refuge manager at Laguna from 1989 through 1995. During Steve's tenure, he made many friends and accomplished much, including helping to restore the Aplomado falcon, groundbreaking work on protecting the endangered ocelot, and promoting an unprecedented spirit of conservation cooperation in the community, which helped lead to the eventual restoration of Bahia Grande. In 1994, Thompson was honored as Refuge Manager of the Year for more than 500 national wildlife refuges nationwide.
You know, I only spent 6 years of my life here, and a lot of people have lived their whole lives here. And when you come from the rest of the parts of the country, it's just, this is a spectacular place. It's an incredible wildlife place, full of diversity, lots of different kinds of wildlife, and it takes a lot of hard work to keep it. And people have been working at this for many, many years, and we have to keep working together to conserve wildlife.
Hardly a more respected and revered biologist than Steve Thompson, really during his generation, if not generations to come. And a huge part of that was because Steve put such a premium on the relationships that he built off the refuge, you know, the partnerships and friendships that he built with ranchers and landowners and the business community and nonprofits. And candidly, that was parlayed into all of the success that he had managing refuges.
There is no finer example of conservation cooperation than the historic restoration of Bahia Grande. And thanks to the leadership of Steve Thompson and the dedicated efforts of many, Bahia Grande will thrive for generations to come.
Steve would have loved that. He would have loved the fact that there are dozens of entities really across the political spectrum that have gotten behind the restoration of the Bahia Grande, because that was Steve. Again, he brought people together.